Welcome to Grove City College's new online course series, The Life of the Mind, Great Lectures from the Grove. I'm Paul McNulty, president of the college, and I'm excited to introduce to you this free online learning opportunity. This new series of lectures will cover various topics which I hope will expand your intellectual curiosity and your depth of knowledge in unique areas of interest. These courses are designed to engage you with topics that discuss ideas that are true, beautiful, and good. By offering this Life of the Mind series, we hope to spur dialogue among friends and family and provide perspective on important issues of our time. Whether you are a high school student using this course to supplement your studies, or an adult simply wanting to expand your mind, we hope that you are strengthened and encouraged by these courses. And now here's the Provost of Grove City College, Dr. Peter Frank, who will introduce our lecturer and the topic of this course. I hope you enjoy these presentations.
Welcome to the first course in our series, Life of the Mind, Great Lectures from the Grove. I'm Peter Frank, Provost at Grove City College. In our first course, Dr. Carl Trueman, professor in the Department of Biblical and Religious Studies, delivers an 8-part course titled Makers of the Modern Revolution. Dr. Trueman is a widely published expert on church history and how individuals shape contemporary culture. He earned a PhD from the University of Aberdeen in Scotland and a master's degree from St. Catherine's College in Cambridge. Thank you for joining us at Grove City College and enjoy this course with Dr. Carl Trueman.
Many people today find themselves disoriented by the speed at which the world is changing, particularly with regard to politics, morality, and the nature and role of traditional institutions. We've seen in the last few decades a crisis in the nation state. We've seen the decline of the church, and we've seen the family thrown into confusion. We live in truly revolutionary times in the truest sense of the word. My own grandfather died just 25 years ago. The whole idea of gay marriage, for example, would have been completely alien to him, let alone transgenderism. The world in which we live now is simply transformed from where it was just a few decades ago. Yet I think part of our confusion derives from the fact that too few of us understand that the speed of change hides the fact that many of the ideas, many of the forces, many of the things, many of the factors shaping how we think about ourselves and our place in the world, these have been forged over many, many centuries. Of course, the whole story of how modern men and women came into being is vast and complicated. We need to take account of technology, the impact of 2 horrendous world wars, the development of the consumer economy after the Second World War. What I want to do in this short series of 8 lectures is give snapshots, brief glances of how some of the central ideas of our age were formulated by a handful of the great thinkers and writers of the last 300 years. These are thinkers not chosen at random. They're men and women who influenced subsequent generations and also crystallized in remarkable ways key elements that, perhaps innovative in their own day, are now cultural commonplaces and part of the intuitive way many of us think about the world. We may never have read their books. Maybe we've never even heard of their names. And yet many of our instincts have been forged and fashioned by the ideas that they first articulated. If, for example, you think society corrupts individuals, then you're the child of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. If you think feelings and emotions, not reason and logic, are where real truth is to be found, you're an heir of the Romantics. If you think the existence of religion indicates that humanity is in bondage to superstition or has abdicated its responsibility to itself, you live in the world of Karl Marx and Friedrich Nietzsche. If you think of life as public performance, perhaps if you enjoy those reality TV shows where people play up for the camera, if you think that personal freedom is more important than traditional morality, then you follow in the footsteps of the great Irish writer Oscar Wilde. And if you define yourself in terms of your sexual desires as straight or gay or bisexual, then you inhabit the world for which Sigmund Freud acted as midwife. And if you think of oppression in terms of psychology and oppressive laws in terms of traditional standards of, say, sexual morality, you're indebted to the thinking of the New Left as it emerged from the 1930s to the 1960s. Rousseau, the Romantics, Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, Oscar Wilde, Sigmund Freud, the New Left. Few of us may have read much or anything by them, but we live in the world that they were instrumental in forging. And the way we intuitively think about that world is in large part the result of their lives, their work, their writings. And in helping us to understand that, I hope that this course will help us to understand ourselves and some of the most pressing issues of our day better than we do. But before we delve into dealing with the specific figures that I want to address in this course, I want to clarify 4 things in this first lecture. 4 particular points, 4 particular characteristics of the modern age that the rest of the lecture series will explicate and expand. The first is that the modern person, the way we think about ourselves, intuitively we might say, the modern self, is characterized by expressive individualism. Come back to that term in just a few moments. Secondly, I want to talk about how the modern person sees happiness as an inward sense of psychological satisfaction. Thirdly, I want to talk about how the modern world is a world that sees all things immanently, not imminently with an I, but immanently with an A. And fourthly, I want to talk about how the modern world is dominated by the effects of the sexual revolution, which really kicked off in the 1960s but has much deeper historical roots. So these are the 4 things I want to address: expressive individualism, happiness and psychological satisfaction. The modern world is a world that sees things imminently, and the modern world is dominated by the effects of the sexual revolution. So what do I mean by these 4 things? Firstly, the modern world is characterized by what I've referred to as expressive individualism. What's expressive individualism? That's the idea that the authentic person, the authentic me, is found in expressing outwardly that which I feel inwardly. That I am most myself, if you like, when I give voice, expression in a public setting or in a social setting to my innermost feelings. We see this sometimes in television confessions where perhaps somebody has left his wife for maybe another man or somebody else, and the person will use language to the effect of, "I've been living a lie. These many years I've been living a lie. I haven't been myself." That speaks of a world where expressive individualism is really the dominant way of thinking about who we are. To live a lie, to live outwardly in a way that I do not feel inwardly. We're all aware of that to some extent. We have that term hypocrite. We talk about hypocrites, those who pretend to be something they're not, that what you see is not actually what you get. More positively, we'll use the term authentic. The authentic person is the person who is exactly who they appear to be. And one of the things that characterizes the modern age is the rise to prominence, the rise to dominance of that notion of what it means to be a human self. You might say, well, that's not exceptional, that's just the way the world is, but it's not always been that way. You can probably tell from my accent that I'm not from the south of New Jersey. I come from England. I had a very traditional education, went to an all-boys grammar school in England, and I was taught that the genuine person was the person who actually demonstrated reserve. You may have heard the term, the English stiff upper lip. I was taught that the really genuine person was the one who actually suppressed their feelings, who behaved outwardly in a certain manner whatever their inner feelings might have been. So this rise to prominence of the expressive individual, that's not just the way it's always been, that's a new thing. One of the things I want to do in the course is trace, explain who it was who formulated that idea and how it's come to be so dominant in our culture. Second, the second point, the modern person sees happiness as an inward sense of psychological well-being. You might say, well, that's odd too. Isn't that what happiness has always been? Well, I think up until recently that's not actually the case. Again, to use my late great-grandfather, he's been dead, as I say, 25 years, but I can imagine a scenario where I'm sitting with my granddad and asking him, Granddad, do you have job satisfaction? My granddad was a poor working man. He spent all his life working as a sheet metal worker in a factory in Birmingham in the industrial heartland of England. He did a job that I would consider to be remarkably monotonous and boring. I would not want to do that job. Yet I'm pretty sure that if I'd explained what I meant by the term job satisfaction to my grandfather, he'd probably responded by saying, yeah, I get satisfaction from my job. It enables me to put money on the table so that my wife can buy shoes for the kids and food for the family. I get satisfaction from my job because of what it enables me to do relative to fulfilling my responsibilities to other people. Now, what's interesting is if you ask me that question, do you get job satisfaction? My instinctive reaction is going to be something like this. Yeah, I get a real kick out of teaching. I enjoy teaching the kids at Grove City. I enjoy engaging in banter with them. I love it. I love it. I get real satisfaction when I see a light bulb go on in somebody's mind that I have taught them something that suddenly makes sense to them. Now notice the difference between the two answers there. When I talk about my grandfather, his satisfaction is very much outwardly directed. It isn't first and foremost a kind of inner sense of psychological happiness for itself. It's relative to what he's done materially for other people. For me, satisfaction is really very much an inner psychological state. Now think about that. Think about that. Isn't that the default way that many of us think about the world? And it also helps, of course, understand why, interestingly enough, that old saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words would never hurt me, has clearly gone by the wayside in recent times. We're all aware now that words are extremely hurtful things, and that people who've said or written things years ago even can be held to account for them. Why? Because words damage people's inward sense of psychological well-being. We live in a world now where happiness is not as it was for my grandfather, something achieved by looking outward. It's something accomplished by looking inward. And that's a function, of course, of my first point, expressive individualism, the idea that the inner life is really what makes me me and is the really important thing in my existence. My inward sense of happiness comes from being outwardly who and what we feel ourselves to be inwardly. So the second point then, the modern person sees happiness really in psychological terms as a sense of inner psychological well-being. The third point, the modern world sees all things immanently. Maybe I should spell that just so that you make it clear that I'm talking here about immanence. I-M-M-A-N-E-N-T-L-Y, immanently. What do I mean by that? Well, the great Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor talks about what he calls the immanent frame. What does he mean by that? He means that we live in a world now where everything is to be understood in terms of the limits of the material world. That there is nothing beyond this world that provides this world with its meaning or sense. Again, you might say, well, isn't that how everybody thinks? Well, I'd say no. You don't have to go back very far to find people who didn't think that way. Think about living in the Middle Ages. If you lived in the Middle Ages and you were wandering through a wood late at night, you'd be terrified about being carried away by the goblins. That strikes us as bizarre now. But that sense of the way the supernatural pervades the natural was very, very strong in the Middle Ages. If you'd been caught in a thunderstorm, you would not have thought of the thunderstorm as a natural occurrence. You'd have thought of it as an act of God. Oddly, we still have that term in law for insurance policies. If your house is destroyed by an earthquake, then technically it may have been destroyed by, quotes, an act of God, things that are sort of random and that can't be explained in some way. We still refer to them as acts of God, but we don't mean that in quite the same way they would have meant in the Middle Ages. When Luther narrowly missed by a thunderbolt, for him that's God's judgment coming against him. It's not just a natural electric shock caused by collision of ice crystals high in the atmosphere. That sense of the way the supernatural pervaded the natural was strong. Think in America. If you think back to the founding of America, you think back to the Puritans. It was the Puritan practice each week, I think, to have a sermon on providence, on the way that God was guiding history. Because the Puritans, their understanding of themselves was intimately connected to their understanding of how this world connected to the greater supernatural nature of being and of the universe. We might find a more specific and perhaps more important for this course example of this in terms of law. Think of morality, think of law. Laws traditionally have been seen in societies prior to our own as in some way derived from an authority outside of society. Ancient Greece, Lycurgus, the semi-mythical founder of the city of Sparta, receives the Spartan law code from the oracle at Delphi. So if anyone had ever said to a Spartan king, why do we have to obey these laws? The answer would have been, we obey them because they were given to us by the gods. The supernatural world has shaped the way we must behave in our ordinary, you might say, secular or social world. We see that in Christianity, a great tradition of natural law that stems from the Middle Ages, is rooted ultimately in the idea that the way the world is to be organized here on earth is to be connected in some way to the character of God himself in eternity. That's what Charles Taylor would characterize as a transcendent frame, that the way we think about this world is connected to the transcendence of the supernatural, that which is beyond this world. The modern age has broken decisively with that. The modern age has broken absolutely decisively with that. And one of the most dramatic ways we see that, of course, is the moral one, the moral sense. Ethics, what is right and what is wrong. Traditionally, that was rooted in some sort of notion of the will of the gods or the will of God. Now it's more and more rooted in what works. Connecting back to my second point, what works to make me happy, what works to make the most people happy. That's become the way in which moral thinking, ethical thinking is driven, as we shall see in later lectures. That's an immanent way of looking at the world. And that marks us off from those who have gone before us. That brings me then to my fourth and final point. And it's really the point where that moral transformation is most dramatically obvious to us today. And that's the modern world is dominated by the effects of the sexual revolution. What do I mean by the sexual revolution? Well, I'm really talking about the dramatic change in the understanding of sex and its significance that's taken place between, say, the late 1950s, early 1960s and today. I mean, it's ongoing every week, every year. We see new changes to morality and matters involving sexuality. So it's an ongoing revolution. It connects, though, to the first 3 points I've made here. I want to offer a little bit of a sharper definition of the sexual revolution, really laying the groundwork for later lectures. First of all, what do I mean by this? I don't mean that it's simply a broadening or loosening of old standards and categories. The sexual revolution is not simply a broadening of what has been accepted before. It actually involves a fundamental overturning and repudiation of what has been done before on the grounds that traditional morality isn't actually healthy at all. It's repressive. It prevents us from, guess what? Being who we really are inside. It's inimical to expressive individualism and to the idea of happiness as that inner sense of psychological satisfaction. So what do I mean by this overthrowing of traditional standards? A couple of aspects to this. First, it involves, let's say, not simply a rejigging or a broadening or a redefinition of old categories. It involves their fundamental overthrow or rejection. Think of modesty, for example, the concept of modesty. It's a long tradition, especially in religiously conservative circles, a long tradition of debates about modesty, and it tends to come down on the whole to how long can a skirt be? Or how short can a skirt be before it isn't modest? Should women wear bikinis or bathing suits at the seaside? Those are the kind of debates that have gone on within Christian circles, within conservative Jewish circles, within Mormon circles, time immemorial. But notice that today the very notion of modesty is actually deemed ridiculous. What we're seeing in society today on the whole are not debates about what is not modest. The whole idea of modesty is completely ridiculous. I'll give you a cultural example from a few years ago. I've never seen the film The 40-Year-Old Virgin. Never seen it. But I know it's a comedy just from the title. How do I know that? Well, I live in a culture where virginity is not regarded as a virtue anymore. 40-year-old virgin is regarded as a ridiculous thing because that person has somehow not fulfilled what they should be as a true and genuine human being. Virginity's come to look intrinsically ridiculous in the culture at large. And that's a fascinating move. It reflects deep changes in the culture, as I say, not simply an expansion of what people have thought before, but a fundamental rejection of what people have thought before. And again, not unrelated to my earlier points, particularly the third one, because modesty and notions of modesty were traditionally rooted in what? The idea that there were transcendent standards of human behavior to which we, here on earth, are to conform ourselves. But that's not the whole of the sexual revolution. The second interesting aspect of it is this. Sexual revolution isn't simply a matter of behavior. People have always broken society's rules on sexual matters. There have always been adulterers, always been those who engage in sexual relations with their own sex. I remember as a fairly naive undergraduate being quite shocked in a Greek poetry reading seminar at college when I suddenly realized the love poem I was reading was written by one woman to another woman. It's gone on time immemorial. But there's a difference again in the modern approach to these things, and it's this. These things in the past have always been regarded as breaking the rules. Society's standards have been different, by and large. Now the rules have been so attenuated as to be almost but not quite non-existent, so they cannot be broken. The rules are virtually gone. So it's not that, people have always committed adultery. It's now adultery carries no social stigma or shame in the way that it would have done for generations past, and that represents interesting change in the way we think. And thirdly, and finally, about the sexual revolution. The sexual revolution is about identity. I mentioned a few moments ago, I read a poem written by a woman to a woman, love poem from ancient Greece. What's different today is this. Sex has changed from being something people do to being something people are. Gay is now no longer a description of an activity so much as it is a description or a statement of identity. The fact that we now think of ourselves not simply in those psychological terms I've been outlining earlier in this lecture, but we think of ourselves primarily in terms of our sexual desire. We even have that term of relatively recent vintage, sexual orientation. The fact that we think that those things are fundamental to who we are, that's a radical break with the past. Lots of homosexual activity in ancient Greece. Nobody thought of themselves as gay. Fascinating change. So why has all this come about? Obviously, as I said at the start of this class, this is too big a story to be told in 8 20-minute lectures. But what I want to do is look at some of the key figures, some of the key ideas that have helped to shape the modern world that looks as I have described it. First though, before we go to the modern world, we need to go back to the 18th century. And we need to assess the significance of a remarkable Genevan philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and the movement, Romanticism, that his thinking inspired.